All right, hello and welcome to the very first video lesson of the All on the Line North Carolina Redistricting Leadership Program. I'm so glad you're here, so let's go ahead and get started. So I've pulled up the course outline here to give you a sense of sort of where you are in the course. Obviously we're at the beginning right now, and I've highlighted the lesson that we're doing today on redistricting and gerrymandering, but this sort of gives you an idea of the content that we're going to work through, and if you want to see this in more detail, you can look at the syllabus that is on the course page. All right. So today we are answering the question of what are redistricting and gerrymandering. And the way we're going to work through this is first we're going to talk about what districts are in the first place. Then we're going to talk a little bit about one person, one vote, the one person, one vote doctrine. We'll talk about the census, and then we will talk about redistricting itself. And then once we've covered redistricting, we'll go into gerrymandering. So what is gerrymandering? And once we've talked about that, we will give a preview of sort of our idea of fair representation, or just sort of like a little hint, because it's something that we will go into a lot of depth on in the rest of the course. All right. So why are we starting here? I think maybe some people would ask, like, why don't we go just straight into the North Carolina process instead of just doing this generic gerrymandering and redistricting definition? I think first of all, we want this course to be accessible to everyone, even people who have not been doing redistricting advocacy for a long time and are maybe coming from other issues and know how redistricting affects their issues and want to get involved. And I also think, honestly, no matter who you are, you know, basically, unless like you're a university professor who does this full time, you'll probably learn something from this lesson. I know that I learned stuff when I was researching to do this lesson, and I did this full time, so. All right, so what are districts? That's the first question we have to answer. So I'm going to read you a definition. A voting district is an administrative subdivision of a larger state, a country, administrative region, or other polity created to provide its population with representation in the larger state's legislative body. And that is from the Wikipedia entry on electoral districts, so you know it has to be right. So what does that actually mean? So in some elections, everyone in the country or state votes. For example, in the U.S., the whole country votes for the president. And I know some of you out there right now are wanting to say something about the Electoral College, and I feel you, but not yet. In North Carolina, the whole state votes for our 2 members of the U.S. Senate, and also statewide for offices like the governor or Supreme Court Justice. All right, so the purpose of districts is to divide population and provide representation. So for example, North Carolina is currently allotted 13 members of the U.S. House of Representatives because of its population. And so the state has been divided into 13 districts, each of which gets to elect its own member of Congress. Similarly, the North Carolina State Legislature is divided into 120 districts for the North Carolina State House members and 50 districts for our state senators. And these maps are the current maps. They were drawn in 2019, and that is also a story I will get into later in this course. And so also I just want to say that although this course is going to focus mostly on congressional and state legislative districts, because that's, you know, our big fight at All on the Line for 2021, a lot of other things are voted by district. So your city councils, your school boards, appeals court judges, lots of other offices use districts to determine representation. So I have put here just like a district map of Raleigh, where I currently live, and each of those districts gets a city council member. All right, one person, one vote. So the important thing to understand is that in the past, in North Carolina, there was no requirement for state legislative districts to have equal population. In fact, each county was actually guaranteed at least 1 House member, and with 120 House members and 100 counties, you can imagine how disproportionate that was in terms of population. Also, there were a lot of other weird things going on. So some districts had 2 state senators, or up to 4 total House members. So, and here is a map from 1941 to 1960 of what our districts looked like for the State Senate and State House. And it comes from this really great booklet that was put together in the 60s by a professor at UNC Chapel Hill, and that's something that I will share with you in our sources page on the course page, because I'm a huge nerd and I love stuff like that, and maybe you want to look at all the maps for districts from 1776 until 1960. I mean, I would. All right, the one person, one vote cases. So, obviously, this disproportionate situation was a problem, and so from 1962 to 1968, a number of cases came before the U.S. Supreme Court that challenged this malapportionment of districts, and it challenged it under the Equal Protection Clause. So the court's decisions in these cases established the one person, one vote doctrine, which means that voting districts have to be drawn with roughly equal populations. And, you know, in case of congressional districts, it's like within one person, usually within, and for state legislative districts, it's like within 5%, but they have to be very close according to the federal Constitution interpretation by the Supreme Court of this doctrine. So, congressional, state legislative, and even local government districts were covered by these decisions. Right. So now districts have to be proportional to population. So how do we know what that population is? Well, the census. So the U.S. Constitution mandates that a census counting the whole number of persons in each state be taken every 10 years. These numbers are the numbers that are traditionally used in North Carolina as the basis for all of our districts, congressional, legislative, and local. And I say traditionally, that's important to note. It's something that I will probably discuss in the next lesson. But for now, just assume that we've always really used census data to draw our districts here in North Carolina. And here's a nice picture of a census taking from, I think, 1810. They used to have U.S. Marshals go around and do it, which, you know, would be different. All right, so we actually have a census ongoing this year. And if you haven't filled it out, you can go to my2020census.gov and do that. Please fill out the census. So the census determines our representation. We may, in North Carolina, actually gain a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives next year because our population has grown so much here, and that's really important. But also, honestly, it determines North Carolina's share of $900 billion federal funds that are distributed every year. And so that's federal funds for things like education and roads and healthcare and all kinds of stuff our state really needs. So please, if you haven't yet, fill out the census. I did it back in February. It took me less than 10 minutes. It's really easy and just really essential for our democracy. All right, so redistricting. Finally, we're here. So what is redistricting? Redistricting is the process whereby every 10 years, or as ordered by a court, which is super important in North Carolina, because we get ordered by a court a lot, we redraw our districts to reflect the change in our population recorded by the census. So basically, we know the population changes. Every 10 years we record that change, and we have to readjust the districts to reflect that change to comply with one person, one vote. So how do we redistrict? Redistricting is done differently in different states. So in a lot of states, like in North Carolina, the state legislatures draw the district maps. So in North Carolina, the state legislature draws the congressional district maps as well as the state legislative maps. And they also draw like judicial maps, which is sort of something I think people don't think about a lot, but they do draw those. But in other states, it's done differently. So, for example, Iowa has a really unique system where the legislative staff are responsible for drawing maps for redistricting. So legislative staff are like the people who, you know, work to keep the legislature running on all kinds of different levels and work with the legislators. So, you know, no other state does it that way, but that's how Iowa does it. And a lot of other states have some form of redistricting commission, you know, a special commission that just does redistricting. So some of these commissions are made up of political appointees, or at least what I would call political appointees, because they are people who are appointed by party leaders in the state to serve on the Redistricting Commission. And then some states like California choose ordinary citizen applicants. So in California, my understanding is that ordinary citizens apply to be part of the commission, and they're basically, after some refining, chosen by lottery to reflect the demographics in the state, which I think is, a really cool system. All right, so we know what redistricting is. So what is gerrymandering? Because that's, what we're here to fight, right? So again, going back to perfect source Wikipedia, that can never be wrong. Gerrymandering is a practice intended to establish an unfair political advantage for a particular party or group by manipulating district boundaries. All right. So manipulating district boundaries, what does that mean? So by drawing district lines in different ways, gerrymandering can ensure that a particular party wins a number of districts that's out of proportion to its actual percentage of the population. So in this very simple example, you have 50 precincts. And if you don't know what a precinct is, it's basically just a smaller unit that makes up a district. So usually when you go to vote in person on election day, you vote in your precinct. So this example has 50 precincts, 60% of them are blue, and 40% of them are red. And so in the middle, you see one way you could draw the districts is so that all 5 districts have majority blue precincts. And so blue wins all 5 districts. And in the second picture, you can see there's a way to draw the districts so that you have 3 red districts and 2 blue districts, and red wins the majority of the districts, which obviously is out of proportion to its actual percentage of the population. Right. So cracking and packing. So cracking and packing are 2 of the main ways that districts can be gerrymandered. So cracking is diluting a particular party's voters across a number of districts. So in that middle image, basically that's what's happening to the red precincts, is that they're being spread through all five districts, so that there's a blue majority in each one, so diluting those voters. And then packing is concentrating a particular party's voters in the smallest possible number of districts to reduce their voting power in other districts. So in the image on the right, you can see that basically the blue precincts have been packed into as few districts as possible, and that's what gives sort of the red districts that disproportionate share of the district makeup. Right. So I wanted to give you some more concrete examples, and these are examples from the plaintiff's complaint in the Common Cause versus Lewis case, which was a partisan gerrymandering case in state court that happened last year in 2019, in which the districts I'm going to show you were determined to be unconstitutional partisan gerrymanders. So how did that happen? So here we're looking at a group of districts that cover Union and Anson counties. So this is outside of Charlotte. So in the image, you can see that Monroe, which is the biggest city in Union County, has basically the Democratic voters there have been split into 2 separate districts to dilute their vote, and paired with Republican areas. And so both of those districts lean Republican. And yeah, so that's how cracking works, is basically you take a group of voters that have similar interests and you break them in half and separate them so that they don't have enough power to vote for a representative of their choice in their area. All right. And okay, so an example of packing. So here you can see a group of districts that cover Pitt and Lenore counties. And what we're seeing here is that Greenville, which is in the upper part of the map, so Greenville itself has a population that is not exactly, but nearly what you would need for a singular House district. So Greenville itself could be its own House district, which, in some ways would make a lot of sense. I think, cities are like a natural community unit. But what's actually happened to Greenville is that the most democratic parts of Greenville have been split off from the rest of the city and paired with the most democratic parts of the surrounding more rural areas. So basically you're taking all of the Democratic voters in that area and pushing them all into one district. And then that means that the Republican parts of the city go with more Republican rural districts. And so you get a defined Democratic district and maybe 2 Republican districts where you might have had a much different composition with much more competitive seats if you had drawn it, based around like the actual city. All right. And again, I will say that both of these examples are from the Common Cause versus Lewis case, and in both cases, a 3-judge Superior Court panel in North Carolina found that both of these sets of districts were unconstitutional partisan gerrymanders. Okay, so we know what gerrymandering is, and I think that obviously raises the question of what fair representation actually looks like, right? That's the obvious next step. Like, how do you make districts fair? So one way that I think a lot of people think about it is in sort of proportionate versus disproportionate outcomes. So here we have some images that are basically the same as the red and blue ones we saw before, but now in green and yellow, I guess, to, shake things up. So on the left, we can see the same breakdown that we saw before, right? So in the left image, we see the green voters being diluted into 5 separate districts. And then in the right image, we see the yellow voters being packed into a smaller number of districts. So those are both ways of drawing the districts with disproportionate outcomes. So on the right, we have an image where we have districts drawn for proportionate outcomes, right? So, there's one way of splitting up the districts where you get, 3 yellow and 2 green, where you just start drawing straight lines. And then on the right, there's like a little bit, more complicated shapes where you get 3 yellow and 2 green districts as well. And those are both outcomes and ways you could draw districts that would mean that the sort of who those districts are electing is proportionate to the way people in those districts are identifying, like just by pure numbers. So I think that this is the way that a lot of people come to the fair maps question. I think that, I think a lot of people's idea is that really what we should be doing is just outsourcing this all to some kind of computer algorithm that can just, draw a bunch of districts and make sure that they all lead to proportionate outcomes, right? Based on, the voting patterns of people in the state. And I think that that idea has a lot of merit to it, and it really makes sense in a lot of ways. But I want to, just complicate that a little bit for you. So the way I want to complicate that is by communities. So this is an example that's relevant to me. So I grew up in Southern Pines in Moore County, in the Sandhills area. And I'm actually, if you can see, I'm wearing my Land of the Pines shirt today with the beautiful longleaf pines that are so abundant there with the giant pine cones. And if you haven't seen them, I feel sorry for you because they're really cool. So in the top left, we see this is like how Moore County is split up into 2 congressional districts currently. So this is also the 2019 map. And the way that it's split up, the part of Moore County that I'm from, Southern Pines, which is in the south part, is in District 9, right? And District 9 goes all the way west and pairs, Southern Pines with actually part of the Charlotte suburbs. So it goes all the way into Mecklenburg County and carves out part of the Charlotte suburbs. And, honestly, growing up in Southern Pines, I don't think I thought about the Charlotte suburbs as being even close to part of the community that I lived in. I would assume that people in the Charlotte suburbs probably have really different needs and interests than people who are in Southern Pines, which is a very, very beautiful town that you should visit sometime. So if you were to ask me, if I were to just pick a group of counties that I felt like were part of the Sandhills community in my personal experience, What I put down on the bottom right would probably be what I would pick. So, you know, I'm from Moore County, so obviously that's part of what I would consider my community. My mom worked at the VA in Fayetteville for years, so that's Cumberland County, so I probably can include that. My mom's best friend and, you know, coworker lived in Rayford, which is Hoke County, and when I was a kid, I went to summer camp, like summer day camp with lots of kids from Rockingham and Laurinburg and Lumberton, which is Richmond, Scotland, and Robeson counties. And then my best friend actually lived in Sanford in Lee County. So, you know, that's a group of counties that I would pick to say, like, what do I think is like the Sandhills? You know, and obviously I think there are a lot of immediate objections to this, right? So first of all, the group of counties I picked is not like a perfect congressional district. It doesn't fall within the numbers, although honestly, it's not too far off. Also, I think, you know, a lot of people would say, well, a lot of people have a different idea of what a community is. People might pick different counties from you. And I think that's all true. But what I would say is I think you would be hard-pressed to find someone in Southern Pines who would say that they feel like they're part of a community with people in the southern suburbs of Charlotte, right? Like, I don't think that that's something that you would find a lot of people would say. So I think that what I'm trying to do here is to show you that there are other interests at play other than pure proportionality. That, you know, districts should also represent the actual interests of the people, and the people within the districts should have, you know, ties and commonalities so that their representation, you know, is relevant to them. So, you know, that's honestly all in the lines approach. If you watched our intro video, you saw me read this before, but I'll read it again. Our mission is to raise awareness about the harmful impact gerrymandering has on federal and state policymaking, create and encourage participation in activities that defend democratic ideals, and most importantly to me, increase grassroots engagement in every step of the redistricting process. So what that means to us is that input from ordinary people is crucial to creating fair districts. Districts should reflect how people actually live and keep communities together. You know, so I think that that's the thing that maybe a purely proportional approach leaves out, is that there are real people who live in these districts, and they deserve districts that not only represent them in a purely proportional way, but represent the communities that they actually live in and are part of, and the connections that they have to other people in their area. So, you know, I think that's all in the lines approach. That's the way that we think about it. That's why we've created this program, because we think it's so important for people to be able to participate in the process in a really informed way so that we can have districts based on the input of actual citizens and how they actually live. All right, so that's the end of the lesson for today. Our next lesson is going to be specifically on redistricting in North Carolina, so we're going to talk about what's legally required in the process, what the process has conventionally looked like, you know, what we think the process might look like next year. So it's all of that to look forward to. And again, I really want to thank you for joining us in this program and listening to this lesson. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. You can find my email in the syllabus. And also, I'm going to be having my very first office hours tomorrow, so that is May 5th, 2020, at 5 p.m. And if you look in the syllabus, you can find the way to register for those office hours so I can see you. And I really hope that you join me, because otherwise I will be sitting there by myself. All right. Again, so glad and so grateful to have all of you here, and looking forward to going through this process with you and learning a lot more. All right. See you soon.